Part 4. Working Getorix's defeat in open warfare, 52 BC. 54. At the Alia, the Aeduans, Viridomarus and Eporidorix asked for an interview with Caesar and informed him that Litaviccus had gone with all the Gallic cavalry to try to seduce the Aedui from their alliance. It was essential, they said, for them to get there before him in order to keep the tribe loyal. By this time Caesar had many proofs of the treachery of the Aedui and felt sure that the result of letting these men go would be to make them revolt all the sooner. However, he thought it unwise to detain them, lest he should be accused of high-handed action or give an impression of being afraid. Before they went, he briefly reminded them of his services to the Aedui, in what a feeble state they were when he received them into alliance, cooped up in their strongholds, stripped of their lands, deprived of all their allies, forced to pay tribute and submit to humiliating demands for hostages, and how he had not merely restored them to their previous position, but had raised them to a height of prosperity, prestige, and power that they had never reached before. Bidding them pass on this reminder to their countrymen, he let them go. 55. Situated in a strategic position on the Loire was an Aeduan town called Noviodunum, to which Caesar had sent all his hostages from the various Gallic states, his stores of grain, public funds, a large part of his personal luggage and that of his troops, and numbers of horses that he had bought in Italy and Spain for use in the war. On reaching this town, Eporidorix and Viridomarus heard the latest news about the Aedui, that Litaviccus had been received at Bibracte, one of their most important towns, and visited by the chief magistrate Convictor Litavis and a large number of councillors, and that an official embassy had been sent to Working Getorix to conclude a treaty of peace and alliance. This was too good a chance, they thought, to be missed. Accordingly, they massacred the garrison at Noviodunum and the merchants who lived there, shared the money and horses, had all the hostages taken to the magistrates at Bibracte, and carried away as much grain as they had time to stow in boats, the rest being thrown into the river or burnt. The town itself they thought they could not possibly hold, so they burnt it to prevent it being of use to the Romans. Then they set about collecting troops from the neighbourhood, placing detachments and pickets along the Loire, and making demonstrations here and there with their cavalry to intimidate the Romans. In this way they hoped either to starve them out or to force them by stress of famine to retire into the province. They were greatly encouraged in this hope by the swollen state of the river, the result of melting snow, which made it to all appearance quite unfordable. 56. Caesar decided that he must act quickly. If he had to build bridges, a battle might be forced upon him, and in that case it would be better to fight before the enemy reinforcements arrived. The only alternative was to alter his whole plan of campaign and retire to the province, a course which some of his frightened officers thought unavoidable. But there were many reasons against it. It was undignified and humiliating. The route was a difficult one leading over the Cevennes. Above all, he was anxious about the legions under command of Labienus, who was separated from him. Accordingly, he made a series of extraordinarily long marches by day and night, and astonished everyone by appearing on the bank of the Loire. The cavalry found a ford good enough for an emergency. All that was needed was for the men to be able to keep their shoulders and arms above water, so as to carry their shields and weapons. Cavalrymen waded in upstream to break the force of the current, and, as the shock of Caesar's appearance unnerved the enemy, the crossing was effected without loss. After provisioning the army with some grain and a quantity of cattle that were found in the neighbouring fields, he marched towards the country of the Senones. 57. Meanwhile, Labienus, leaving the draft recently arrived from Italy at Aedudincum to protect the baggage, started with his 4 legions for Lutetia, a town of the Parisii situated on an island in the Seine. When the Gauls knew of his approach, large forces were assembled from the neighbouring tribes, and the chief command was given to an Aulercan named Camulogenus, who, although enfeebled by age, was called out of retirement to this post of honour on account of his unrivalled knowledge of warfare. Camulogenus noticed a long stretch of marsh which drained into the Seine and rendered a wide area almost impassable. Encamping nearby, he prepared to prevent the Roman troops from crossing it. 58. Labienus first tried, under cover of a line of mantlets, to make a causeway across the marsh on a foundation of fascines and other material. Finding this too difficult, he silently quitted his camp some time after midnight and retraced his steps to Metlosedum, a town of the Senones, situated like Lutetia on an island in the river. He seized some 50 boats, quickly lashed them together to form a bridge, and sent troops across to the island. Such of the inhabitants as were left in the town, many had been called up to the war, were terrified by this unexpected attack and surrendered the place without a fight. After repairing a bridge recently broken down by the enemy, Labienus crossed to the right bank of the river, marched downstream to Lutetia, and encamped near it. The enemy, informed of this by refugees from Metlosedum, sent orders to burn Lutetia and destroy its bridges. They then moved from their position by the marsh and encamped on the left bank opposite Labienus. 59. By this time, people were saying that Caesar had retreated from Gergovia, and rumours were circulating about the insurrection of the Aedui and the success of the general Gallic rising. Gauls who got into conversation with Roman soldiers said that Caesar had been prevented from continuing his march across the Loire and compelled by famine to return to the province. The news of the Aeduan rebellion encouraged the Bellovaci, who had already been meditating revolt, to mobilize and make open preparations for war. Now that the situation was so much changed, Labienus saw that he must completely revise his plans. He no longer had any idea of making conquests or attacking, but was only concerned to get his army safely back to Agedincum. On one side he was threatened by the Bellovaci, reputed the bravest fighters in Gaul. On the other, Camulogenus had a well-equipped army ready for action, and Labienus's own legions were separated from their reserves and their baggage by a great river. Confronted suddenly by such formidable difficulties, he realized that only resolute courage could save him. 60. Towards evening he assembled his officers. Urging them to execute his orders with energy and care, he placed a Roman knight in charge of each of the boats which he had brought from Metlosedum, and ordered them to move silently 4 miles downstream in the early part of the night and wait for him there. He detailed to guard the camp the 5 cohorts which he considered least reliable in action, and told the remaining 5 of the same legion to start upstream with all the baggage shortly after midnight, making as much commotion as possible. He also requisitioned some smaller boats, which he sent in the same direction at high speed, with loud splashing of the oars, and then himself moved quietly out of camp with the other 3 legions, and marched downstream to the place where he had ordered the main flotilla to put in. 61. The enemy patrols posted all along the river were taken by surprise, because a sudden heavy downpour concealed the approach of the legions, and both infantry and cavalry were quickly ferried across under the superintendence of the knights in charge of the boats. Just before dawn, the enemy received several reports almost simultaneously: that there was an unusual commotion in the Roman camp, that a strong force was marching upstream, that the sound of oars was audible from the same direction, and that a little way downstream soldiers were being ferried across. This news made them think that the Romans were crossing at 3 different places and preparing for a general retreat in alarm at the revolt of the Aedui. They therefore divided their own troops into 3 sections. One section remained on guard opposite the Roman camp. A small force was dispatched towards Metlosedum with orders to advance upstream as far as the boats had gone, and the remainder were led against Labienus. 62. By dawn, the whole of the 3 legions had been taken across and were in sight of the enemy. Labienus urged them to remember their long-standing tradition of courage and brilliant successes, and to imagine that Caesar, who had so often led them to victory, was present in person. He then gave the signal to attack. At the first onset, the right wing, where the 7th Legion was posted, drove back the enemy and put them to flight. On the left, where the 12th Legion was, the enemy's front rank were killed or disabled by missiles, but the rest put up a determined resistance, and it was clear that not a single one of them had any thought of flight. Camulogenus was there in person encouraging his men. The issue still hung in the balance when the 7th Legion, whose military tribunes had received a report of what was happening on the left wing, appeared in the enemy's rear and charged. Even then not a single Gaul gave ground. All of them, including Camulogenus, were surrounded and killed. The detachment left on guard opposite Labienus's camp, on hearing that a battle was being fought, went to lend a hand and occupied a hill, but could not withstand the charge of the victorious Romans and joined their fleeing comrades. All who could not escape into woods or hills were killed by the cavalry. On the completion of this action, Labienus returned to Aedui, where he had left all the baggage, and then rejoined Caesar with his entire force. 63. The defection of the Aedui was a signal for a further extension of the war. They sent embassies into every part of Gaul and used all their influence, prestige, and money to induce other tribes to join them. The possession of the hostages whom Caesar had left in their keeping gave them another means of exerting pressure. By threatening to kill them, they could intimidate tribes which hesitated. They asked Vercingetorix to visit them and arrange a plan of campaign, and when he came, claimed the chief command for themselves. He refused their demand, and a pan-Gallic council was summoned at Bibracte. There was a full attendance of tribesmen from all parts. The matter was referred to their decision, and they unanimously confirmed the appointment of Vercingetorix. The chief absentees were the Remi and Lingones, who stuck to their alliance with Rome, and the Treueri, who remained neutral throughout because they lived at a distance and were harassed by German attacks. It was a bitter disappointment to the Aedui to have their claim to leadership rejected. It was with great reluctance that Eporedorix and Viridomarus, young men who regarded themselves as having a great future, took orders from Vercingetorix. 64. The various tribes were required to send hostages to Vercingetorix by a certain date, and the whole of the cavalry, numbering 15,000, was ordered to concentrate immediately at Bibracte. He said that he would content himself with infantry, which he had in the previous campaign, and would not tempt fortune by fighting a pitched battle. With his great cavalry strength, it would be quite easy to prevent the Romans from getting corn and forage. All you have to do, he concluded, is to destroy your corn crops without hesitation and burn your granaries, knowing that this sacrifice will make you free men forever and rulers over others. He then commanded the Aedui and the Segusiawi, a tribe living on the provincial frontier, to supply 10,000 infantry, which together with 800 cavalry were placed under the command of Eporedorix's brother and detailed to attack the Allobroges. At the same time, however, hoping that the memory of their recent defeat by Rome, 61 BC, still rankled in the minds of the Allobroges, Vercingetorix tried to seduce them from their allegiance by sending secret agents and envoys who offered bribes to their chiefs and promised the tribesmen that they should be made rulers of the whole province. In another direction, the Gabali and the southernmost clans of the Arverni were sent to attack the Helvii, while the Ruteni and Cadurci were to devastate the country of the Volcae Aricomicae. 65. To meet these various assaults, a force of militiamen amounting to 22 cohorts had been raised in the province itself by the general Lucius Caesar, and was posted all along the threatened frontier. The Helvii, who chose to offer battle to the invaders advancing across their borders, were defeated with heavy loss, their chief magistrate, Gaius Valerius Dominatorus, son of Valerius Scaburus, being among the casualties, and were compelled to take shelter behind the walls of their strongholds. The Allobroges posted a closely linked chain of pickets along the Rhone and protected their frontier with great vigilance. Meanwhile, Caesar found a way of remedying his inferiority in cavalry. Since all the roads were blocked and no reinforcements could be got from the province or from Italy, he sent across the Rhine to the German tribes which he had subdued in previous campaigns and obtained some of their cavalry, attended by the light infantrymen who always fought among them. As their horses were unsuitable for the service required of them, he mounted the Germans on horses requisitioned from the military tribunes and other Roman knights serving with him, and from the time-expired volunteers. 66. During all this time, the Gauls were concentrating the troops which had been operating in the country of the Arverni and the cavalry levied from all over Gaul. A large number of cavalry had now been assembled, and while Caesar was marching through the southeastern part of the Lingones territory into that of the Sequani, so as to be in a better position for reinforcing the provincial troops, Vercingetorix established himself in 3 camps, about 10 miles from the Romans, summoned his cavalry officers to a council, and addressed them. "The hour of victory," he said, "has come. The Romans are fleeing to the province and abandoning Gaul. But although this will assure our liberty for the moment, for future peace and security we need more than that, otherwise they will return in increased force and continue the war indefinitely. So let us attack them on the march while they are encumbered with their baggage. If the whole column of infantry halts to come to the rescue, they cannot continue their march. If, which I feel sure is more likely, they abandon the baggage and try to save their own skins, they will be stripped of the supplies without which they cannot live, and disgraced into the bargain. As for their cavalry, not a man of them will dare even to stir outside the column. You ought to know that as well as I do. To encourage your men, I will drop all my troops in front of the camps and overawe the enemy." The cavalrymen cried that they should all swear a solemn oath not to allow any man who had not ridden twice through the enemy's column to enter his home again, or to see his wife, children, or parents. 67. This proposal was approved, and every man was duly sworn. Next day their cavalry was divided into 3 sections, 2 of which made a demonstration on either flank of the Roman column, while the third barred the way of the vanguard. Caesar also divided his cavalry into 3 sections and ordered them to advance against the enemy. Simultaneous engagements took place all along the column, which halted and formed a hollow square with the baggage inside. If Caesar saw the cavalry in difficulties anywhere, or especially hard pressed, he moved up some of the infantry and formed line of battle, which hindered the enemy's pursuit and encouraged the cavalry by the assurance of support. At length, the German horse gained the top of some rising ground on the right, dislodged some of the enemy, and chased them with heavy loss to a river where Vercingetorix's infantry was posted. At this, the rest of his cavalry fled, afraid of being surrounded, and were cut down in numbers all over the field. 3 Aeduans of the highest rank were brought to Caesar as prisoners. The cavalry commander Cotus, who had been convictor Litavis' rival at the recent elections, Coarilus, who after Litawicus deserted the Roman cause had been placed in command of the Aeduan infantry, and Eporidorix, leader of the Aedui in their war with the Sequani before Caesar's arrival in Gaul, 70 to 65 BC.